co-chair of the Anti-Militarism Committee for Brooklyn for Peace. We spend our time trying to prevent young people from going into the military. And so it is it is therefore particularly appropriate, I think, that I introduce our next speaker. Paul Chappell comes from a military family. He's a graduate of West Point, served 8 years in the military, and including a tour in Iraq. He is currently the Peace Leadership Director of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And Paul comes here to challenge us. He comes here as a warrior for peace. He's explicit about that he is, he takes a soldier's ethic, the four principal parts of which are as follows, and I think that we as peace activists need to think about and engage with this ethic and what Paul has to say about being a warrior for peace. First, the first part of it is that the mission comes first, a selfless point. All of these are selfless points. As peace activists, we too believe that one can never accept defeat as the permanent result. We never quit. Obviously, because you're here today, you know you never quit because you should be outside, right? Okay, and we never leave a fallen comrade. Those are the four elements that Paul describes as the warrior's ethic, a soldier's ethic. We have a lot to learn from this. Let me raise two very different parts and points that Paul has engaged with. One is, what is it that we see is the future for the military? Let's engage that thought experiment. We are now king. And it's always good to be king, but what are we going to do with the military if and when we become king? What is it we're supposed to do with them? Let me raise another point that Paul brings up that I think we need to think about, which is, as we're dealing with the question of the military versus contractors. Paul points out that it's one of the great achievements of American democracy that we have a military that for 200 years has unquestioningly accepted the proposition that civilians make the decisions. So when somebody like General MacArthur says, oh no, let's have a war with China, President Truman says, thank you for your service, it's been wonderful, but we'll see you later. No matter how much and how popular General MacArthur was. And that old soldier, in fact, faded away. It's really important for us, I think, to think about this, particularly with regard to the issue of contractors, because civilian control of corporations and contractors has not been nearly as successful in our 200 years in the military. I point these two very different points out because I think we've got a lot to learn from Paul. I hope you will give him a warm welcome, and let's listen to what he's got to say.
I want to begin by asking you all a question, and I want to begin by asking you, what do you think when you hear the words world peace? When you hear the words world peace, what comes to mind? When you hear world peace?
Unrealistic.
Unrealistic. What else do you think?
Idealism.
Idealism?
Humanist.
Right.
Humanist.
Humanist, right? What do you think most Americans think when they hear the words world peace? They think it's a joke, right? They think of beauty pageant contestants. Have any of you seen the movie Miss Congeniality with Sandra Bullock? Well, there's a scene in the film where there's a beauty pageant, an interviewer asks the beauty pageant contestants what they want, and they all say, world peace. And it's supposed to be a joke, right? Because world peace is supposed to be a joke. So do you see the problem there? As long as our culture believes that world peace is a joke, how can we ever take practical steps in that direction? So we really have to answer this question, is world peace even possible? Is it possible to end politically organized violence between countries, or will we always have this system of politically organized violence between countries? So I can tell you what I thought about world peace when I was growing up, because I didn't grow up in the peace movement. So for a long time, I thought that world peace was a naive dream. My father served in the army for 30 years, and he fought in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. My mother lived in Japan during World War II, and she lived in Korea during the Korean War. I graduated from West Point. I served in the Army for 7 years. I was deployed to Baghdad, and I left the Army just 2.5 years ago as a captain. But what if I told you that I learned at West Point and in the Army that world peace is possible? Furthermore, a simple question can help us understand whether world peace is possible or whether world peace is a naive dream. And that question is, are human beings naturally violent or naturally peaceful? If human beings are naturally violent, and war is something they were supposed to do, then it would be naive to assume that world peace could ever happen. But if human beings are naturally peaceful, and we have to be trained and conditioned to become violent, then world peace just might be possible. World peace just might have a chance. So please raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally violent. Okay? Raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally peaceful.
Peaceful.
Okay. Raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally violent and naturally peaceful. Okay. Most hands go up on that one, technically. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. And it's actually a very counterintuitive idea. If you talk about us not being naturally violent, it's actually a very counterintuitive idea. And I'll give you a couple other examples of counterintuitive ideas. If you were to go back 2,000 years ago and try to convince somebody that the Earth goes around the sun, would that be an easy or hard thing to do? It'd be nearly impossible, because if you went back 2,000 years ago and tried to convince somebody that the Earth goes around the sun, they'd say, well, if the Earth is moving, why don't I feel motion? Doesn't feel like anything's moving. And if you look up, it looks like the sun and the moon are going around me, right? Even today, we still say the sun rises, the sun sets. And if you were to go back 2,000 years ago and try to convince somebody that the Earth is round, would that be an easy or hard thing to do? It'd be nearly impossible, because if the Earth is round, if the Earth is like a ball, why don't the people on the bottom of the Earth fall off? Right? Why don't the people on the sides slide off? It makes no sense, unless you understand how gravity works. It's actually a very counterintuitive idea. And the idea that we're not naturally violent is also very counterintuitive, because if you say we're not naturally violent, people go, well, why is there murder? Why is there war? Why is there genocide? So we'll talk about why those things actually happen. And I'll begin by asking all of you a question. What is the greatest problem of every army in world history? Every army in world history, no matter what time period or culture, has a single greatest problem. Can any of you guess what that problem is? Supplies? Supplies, right? That's a good answer. Armies, by the way, have lots of problems. Supply, logistics, recruiting. The opposing army is a big problem. Right? But this problem is even bigger than the opposing army, because if you don't solve this problem, you won't have a chance to fight the opposing army. Oh, getting soldiers to kill. Getting soldiers to kill. That's a big problem. But this problem is actually bigger than getting soldiers to kill.
Dissatisfaction in the ranks?
Close. The greatest problem of every army in world history isn't getting soldiers to kill, it's getting soldiers to die. Most people don't want to die a violent, horrible death. And the greatest problem of every army in world history is when a battle begins, how do you stop soldiers from running away? In combat, our flight response is far more powerful than our fight response. Most people's natural reaction, when you try to stab them with a sword or shoot them with a rifle, most people's natural reaction is to run away as fast as they can, as far as they can. Ask anyone who's been in combat, and they will tell you it's terrifying. And General Patton said, anyone who says they're not afraid in combat is a liar. So our instinct, if you look at our fight or flight response, when someone's trying to cut your head off, typically your flight response is more powerful than your fight response. If I went out to the street and pulled a knife on somebody, the vast majority of people would want to get away from me, right? And now here you are telling your 5,000 soldiers, I want you to run toward these 5,000 soldiers, and they're all going to try to stab you and mutilate you and cut your head off. Or the opposing army might outnumber you. They might outnumber you 3-1. How do you get your soldiers to fight and not retreat? So how did armies throughout history learn to make soldiers fight and not retreat? What is the most effective method the armies throughout history have used to make soldiers fight and not retreat?
Court-martial?
Court-martial? Right, yes? These are all good answers. So, first of all, court-martial, or some armies, they'd put a guy in the back with a machine gun. So if you ran away, you get shot by your own soldiers. But if your army killing itself, that's not very efficient, right? You want your army killing the other side. And if you are threatened with a court-martial, what's a bigger fear? Getting court-martialed or 10,000 people at you running at you trying to cut your head off? And if you retreat and your commander gets killed and stays behind, I mean, who's going to court-martial you? When the Spartans were defeated by Thebes, Thebes, a Greek city-state, there were a couple of climactic battles. The Spartans retreated in those battles. There's this big mythology how the Spartans never retreated, but it's not true. But somebody said it. And here's a way to make this very clear. What would all of you die for? Raise your hand if you would risk your life to protect your family. If your loved ones are in danger, would you put your life at risk? That's why the army has this whole thing about brotherhood, and the band of brothers and comrades. It's actually to keep people from retreating off the battlefield. And I think Lao Tzu, a Chinese philosopher, said it best when he said, "By being loving, we are capable of being brave." The Greeks realized that if soldiers believe they are fighting to protect their friends, their family, and their loved ones, they will not only fight, but they will even sacrifice their lives, because our instinct to protect our loved ones is far more powerful than our instinct for self-preservation. Think about how you would react if you saw your loved ones being attacked. Think about how you would rush to their aid and try to protect them. So I heard a story on the radio a few years ago that illustrates this. I heard a story a few years ago about an 80-year-old woman, and she was walking down the street, and there was a loose pit bull running toward her. So what would you do if you were walking down the street and there was a loose pit bull running right at you? Would you want to get away from the pit bull, or would you want to get in a fight with the pit bull? Exactly, run at the pit bull. Now what if there's a tree right next to you? Would you climb the tree, or would you fight the pit bull? Climb the tree. What if you're right next to your car? Would you go inside your car, or would you fight the pit bull? Right? That's madness, fighting a pit bull running right at you. But this story was about an 80-year-old woman, and she was walking her little poodle, and the pit bull ran up and clamped its jaws on the poodle, and the 80-year-old woman bent down and bit the pit bull on the neck until the pit bull let go. Actually bit the pit bull. But think about how the dynamic changes. If it's just you and the pit bull, your instinct is to run. But now imagine a pit bull attacking your child, or your grandchild, or your parent, or your spouse, or your best friend. Your attitude completely changes, and you have this urge to protect your loved one. You grab a stick, grab a rock, do whatever you can to protect your loved one. And at West Point, that's why armies require camaraderie and brotherhood in order to function. At West Point, I learned a famous passage from Shakespeare's Henry V, which reads, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." West Point also taught me to treat my military unit like my family. And your military unit becomes your family. You live with these people. And army training puts you in situations where you have to protect them with your life, where you have to sacrifice for each other, and where you can't get anything done without teamwork and cooperation. And that builds very strong bonds between people. And then in combat, you're put in a situation where if you retreat, the people who have become your family will die, and you have to fight to protect the people you care about. Have any of you seen the movie Forrest Gump? Oh, yeah. Why did Forrest Gump risk his life to save Bubba in the Vietnam scene? They were best friends, right? They were like brothers. So armies make soldiers love each other, and then they will die for each other. So the way an effective army works, an effective army takes people from every background, every racial background, poor people, middle-class people, black people, white people, Hispanic people, and turns them into a family. This really strong band of brothers, comrades, puts them in a situation where people are trying to kill their family, and then people have to fight to protect their family. So love of comrades is one psychological technique that the Greeks used to make soldiers fight and not retreat. Another psychological technique that the Greeks used was love of country. Have any of you heard of the Battle of Thermopylae? Raise your hand if you heard of the Battle of Thermopylae. Okay. Raise your hand if you heard of the movie 300. Okay, same battle, except the movie's not very realistic. During the Persian War, the decisive battle was not the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartans were defending a pass against the Persians. The decisive battle was the Battle of Salamis, where the Athenian general Themistocles had to defeat a very large Persian navy with a very small Greek navy. So imagine how frightening it is to have one person trying to kill you. Now imagine being outnumbered 3-1, 4-1, 5-1. So the Athenians were greatly outnumbered, and to inspire the courage that made the victory possible, the Athenians shouted the following battle cry: "Advance, ye sons of Greece, from oppression save your wives, save your children, save your country. This day the common cause of all demands your valor." Most people will die to protect their loved ones. I think many of you would die to protect your loved ones. So when the Athenians heard that, "Advance, ye sons of Greece, from oppression save your wives, save your children, save your country. This day the common cause of all demands your valor," they were ready to fight to the death. And I think that battle cry has been used by every government since then. Not word for word, but the essence of the battle cry. Because whenever a government wants to make a population go to war, they have to say that we're fighting to protect our freedom, or our way of life, or our family, or our loved ones. How many wars have there been in human history? How many wars? How many? Take a guess.
5,000?
Too many to count. I don't even know the number. It might be thousands, depending upon how you define war. You have civil war as well, right? But do you know in all of world history, all of military history, there has never been a single war where a national leader told his people they're fighting for money or gold or oil. Every war is about what? Self-defense, liberating people, fighting for freedom, or any kind of ideals, right? Democracy. So imagine you're a poor Roman farmer, and the Roman emperor says to you, look, I want you to go to war, okay? And the worst case scenario for you is you die, and your wife becomes a widow, and your children become orphans. And the best case scenario for you is you come back to your farm. You say, are you crazy? I'm not going to go fight in any war. But what if the Roman emperor says, look, if you don't go to war, these evil people in this far-off land are going to come kill your family and take away your farm and take away your way of life. Then the Roman farmer is going to fight ferociously. But every war in human history is never about gold, it's never about anything other than self-defense, liberating people, or freedom or democracy. You look at the colonial powers in Europe. Throughout the entire colonial period, we're liberating people. We're giving people Christianity and we're giving them a better way of life. They're living in darkness now. We have to liberate these barbarians in Africa and South America. Roman emperors had the exact same line of rhetoric. So another question. What does war do to the human mind? What does prolonged exposure to war do to the human brain? What does it do to the human mind?
Destroys it.
Destroys it, right? War is one of the most traumatizing things a human being can go through. War drives people insane. Have all of you heard of saying war is hell? Even the people who support war will say that war is hell. So war is one of the most traumatizing things a human being can go through. War drives people insane. But if human beings are naturally violent, why would war traumatize so many people? If we were naturally violent, why wouldn't people go to war and become more mentally healthy? Right? If we were naturally violent, why wouldn't we go to war and become more mentally healthy? And then we're away from war and we start to fall apart because we haven't had enough war. So there was a study done, conducted by the Army. There were two medical doctors in the Army, Swink and Marchand. And they were in World War II, and they conducted a study in World War II that found that after 60 days of sustained day and night combat, 98% of soldiers suffer psychiatric trauma. Keep in mind that 60 days of sustained day and night combat is a 20th century phenomenon. Because prior to the 20th century, soldiers typically took the nights off. How long was the Battle of Gettysburg? 3 days, and they took the nights off, right? And in World War I, World War II, in the 20th century, you had the first time in human history where people were trapped in constant day and night combat. Trapped in constant day and night combat, constant artillery bombardment. And what happens to the human mind when there's people in that kind of situation? And what this Army study found was after 60 days of sustained day and night combat, 98% of soldiers suffer psychiatric trauma. But 2% of soldiers can be exposed to war for long periods of time and kill and kill and kill and never go insane. So why is that 2% different? Why can 2% of soldiers be exposed to war for long periods of time and never go insane, and why can the other 98% not do that? The reason why 2% of soldiers are never driven insane by war is because they were already insane before they went to war. The study found that 2% is composed primarily of aggressive psychopaths. And this is why the Army does combat rotations, right? Why does the Army send people there for a year, bring them back for a year, back and forth? Why doesn't the Army just leave people over there indefinitely? It's because the human brain can't handle the stress. So the Army even acknowledges this through the way it does combat rotations. World War II, you didn't come back. You just went over there, and you stayed over there until the war was won. But after World War II, the Army started doing combat rotations, right? And now you hear a lot of complaints about how soldiers aren't being given enough time back in the States to recuperate, and that's because of the fact that war damages the human mind. So think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would war traumatize the human brain? Another question. During World War II, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy actually fired their weapons at the enemy? During World War II, what percent of soldiers in combat? Close. About 40%, good guess. It was about 15% of soldiers in World War II who had a chance to fire actually fired their weapons at the enemy. Now, during the Vietnam War, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy actually fired their weapons at the enemy? Was it higher? The same? Well, you'd think it'd be lower, right? You'd think it'd be lower, right? Because during World War II, we were fighting the Nazis, and Japan attacked us on their own soil. What did the Vietnamese ever do to us? Prior to the Vietnam War, most Americans had never heard of Vietnam. But it was higher. How much higher do you think it was? 75. 75? It was about 90%.
Wow.
About 90%. 3 decades goes from about 15% to 90% in 3 decades. World War II is about 15%. Korean War, about 15% of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy fired the weapons at the enemy. During the Vietnam War, it's about 90%. Today, it's nearly 100%. So what happened? What happened to cause that drastic change in such a short amount of time?
They broke you in basic training.
And what did they do in basic training that was different?
Dehumanize.
Reflexive training.
Reflexive training. Who said that? Great. That's it. Reflexive training. Reflex training. I'll talk about how that works. Dehumanization, we'll talk about that next. But reflex training. I mean, martial artists are trained to kill, but they're not trained to dehumanize. If you look at martial artists, you look at police officers, their training doesn't have formalized dehumanization, but they're certainly trained to kill. What it comes down to is reflex training. And here's an example of how reflex training works. If I were to go out into the street and punch some random person in the face, what would 99% of people do?
Get away.
I mean, what's your 99% of people, no boxing training, no martial arts training, what's their first reaction? It's to flinch, right? Flinch, close your eyes, try to protect your face. That's your natural reaction, is to flinch. That's your natural reaction, that's a very smart reaction, right? Because your eyes are very vulnerable, your face is very vulnerable, protect your face. Now, let's say that every day for an hour a day, I hit a punching bag. Every day for an hour a day, I hit a punching bag. And then I do that every day for an hour a day for a year. Now what do I do if someone tries to hit me? I'm not going to punch him back, I'm going to flinch. Because a punching bag never tries to hit me back, right? I can hit a lot harder, I have a lot more power, but I'm still going to flinch. That's still my natural reaction. Now, in addition to hitting a punching bag every day for an hour a day, what if I have a martial arts training partner? And he simulates punching me, and I evade and I counterattack. He simulates punching me, I evade and I counterattack. He simulates punching me, I evade and I counterattack. Now what will I do if someone tries to hit me? Now I will counterattack. Especially if you add sparring, right? If you add sparring, realistic sparring to that, where you develop this new reaction. If you watch boxers and martial artists, they do not flinch. Watch a really good boxer and the punch is coming right at his face, he doesn't even blink. Just from that repetition. So it's almost like reprogramming the brain to have a different natural reaction. And here's a story of how powerful the reflex training is. Here's a story of how powerful the reflex training is. This is a story from Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He wrote a book called On Killing, which is where I'm pulling a lot of these figures from. And he tells a story about these 2 police officers. And they were training how to disarm a gunman. So the one police officer, he'd have his training partner pull out a pistol on him. He'd disarm it, give it back to him. His training partner pull out a pistol again, he'd disarm it, give it back to him. Training partner pull out a pistol again, he'd disarm it, give it back to him. Hundreds and hundreds of times they did this. Over and over again until it became a reflex. So then one day they went to a convenience store and there was a robber with a gun. The police officer went around the corner, disarmed the gun, and without thinking, gave it right back to him. So the reflex training is so powerful, you can train people to do things that will get them killed. And that's why the Army has a saying, train like you fight. You have to have very realistic training where you train like you fight. So if you look at Vietnam, if you look at World War II, right? Soldiers would fire at targets shaped like a round paper bullseye. But there's never been a country in history attacked by round paper bullseyes. But during the Vietnam War, you have a target shaped like a human being, it pops up, you shoot it, it goes down. Target shaped like a human being, it pops up, you shoot it, it goes down. Over and over again, where it becomes a reflex. And this goes back way before World War II. During the Civil War, soldiers spent 95% of their time loading their rifles and 5% of their time aiming and firing their rifles. So you would think that if thousands of rifles had been recovered from soldiers killed in combat during the Civil War, then most of them would not be loaded. But after the Battle of Gettysburg, they recovered about 27,000 rifles. 24,000 of the rifles, 90% were loaded. 12,000 of the rifles had more than 1 bullet loaded in the barrel. 6,000 of the rifles had 3 to 10 bullets loaded in the barrel. And one of the rifles had 23 bullets loaded in the barrel. So do you see what was happening? Soldiers were loading over and over again, so it would look like they're doing something, but they weren't actually firing. But now things are dramatically different, because the training is so much different. But think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would every army in history have to expend so much effort in order to train people how to kill? If we were naturally violent, people would show up to boot camp, and on day 2 they could kill people. But that's not the case. So another question. Have any of you read a book called On Killing, written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman? A book called On Killing. It's a book all about killing. And it's one of the most uplifting books you will ever read because it shows that killing is a learned behavior. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman was a West Point psychology professor and Army Ranger, and he wrote a book called On Killing, the Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. On Killing is required reading in classes at West Point. It's required reading at the FBI Academy. It's on the Marine Corps Commandant's required reading list, and it's also required reading in peace studies programs at Berkeley and in Quaker and Mennonite colleges. And the premise of his book is that it is not natural for human beings to kill other human beings. And he bases this off military history. He says, it is unnatural for human beings to kill other human beings, and we actually have a natural resistance to killing other human beings. And he says other animals also have a natural resistance to killing their own species. He says, for example, rattlesnake. Rattlesnake will bite every other animal with its lethal fangs, but when rattlesnakes fight each other, what do? They wrestle. If you look at king cobra not only bite every other animal, they actually eat other snakes. But when king cobras fight each other, they wrestle. If you look at buffalo, bulls, deer, any animal with horns, when they fight other animals, they always try to attack the animal from the flank, from the side, to gut the animal. But when they fight each other, they always fight head-to-head, the least lethal form of combat. So if you look at an African buffalo, when it fights a lion, it'll try to hit the lion in the ribs and kill it. But when African buffalo fight each other, they always fight head-to-head, the least lethal form of combat. A lot of predators, hyena, leopards, lions, when they fight other species, they go for strangulation bites. When they fight their own species, they tend not to go for strangulation bites. Now, not all animals have this aversion, and animals do die from fighting each other. But if they fought each other the way they fought other species, the casualty rate would be much, much higher.